Hey guys, so guess what? We have decided to make another movie that's based off the popular fairy tale, Cinderella. What? Another Cinderella movie, you ask? Well, you see, this isn't going to be your average Cinderella retelling. We're going to make the Cinderella story more realistic and actually have a female protagonist who is outspoken and can kick butt if she has to. Because we haven't seen a Cinderella retelling like this before. Okay, we'll roll with that. Caution! The following video is an in-depth review of the movie I'm currently reviewing, which means that there will be massive spoilers in the review. If you haven't seen this movie yet, then please feel free to watch this movie first before watching this video. However, if you have already seen this movie, or you just want to know my thoughts on this movie, then keep watching. Ever After was a unique type of film that was made in 1998. It came out during the Disney Renaissance era, which consisted of movies that were based off of various fairy tales like Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, and Mulan, to name a few. So of course Fox decided to make their own version of the classic Cinderella fairy tale called Ever After: A Cinderella Story, which starred Drew Barrymore and Angelica Houston. The film was fairly successful at the time, and part of the film's success was that it came out during the time where fairy tale retellers were becoming the norm in Hollywood thanks to the huge success of the Disney Renaissance era films. I have always been a huge fan of fairy tales, and the reason why I was interested in watching this film at the time was because it was a retelling of Cinderella, and I wanted to see this film's own spin on the Cinderella tale. So before I get into what I liked and hated about this film, I would like to give a brief summary of this film. The movie starts off with the Brothers Grimm visiting the Grand Dame of France, and even though the Grand Dame enjoyed the Brothers Grimm stories, she felt that the Cinderella story was a bit incorrect. So she decided to tell the Brothers Grimm the real story of Cinderella. The real story of Cinderella started off with a young girl named Danielle de Barrac who was living happily with her father, and it turns out that she was getting a new stepfamily. Danielle's father ended up marrying the Baroness Ramilla de Ghent, who also has two daughters named Marguerite and Jacqueline. One tragic day, however, Danielle's father was about to go out to town when all of a sudden, he suffered a fatal heart attack. In his dying breath, he told Danielle how much he loved her and said nothing to his new wife Ramilla. This turn of events caused Ramilla to despise Danielle, and for the next 10 years, Ramilla made Danielle to a servant in her household, despite the fact that Danielle was her stepdaughter. One day, however, when Ramilla ended up selling one of her servants to pay her debts, Danielle decided to dress herself up as a noblewoman named Nicole de Lancret, which she borrowed the name from her real mother, and saved the servant from being sold. This heroic act impressed Henry, the Crown Prince of France, that he became interested in Nicole, and eventually Danielle and Henry fell in love with each other. But the blossoming romance between Danielle and Henry might be in jeopardy if Henry discovers that Nicole is actually Danielle, a servant girl. So Danielle has to do everything in her power to prevent Henry from discovering the truth about her while she tries to deal with her feelings for Henry. Ever After always had a special place in my heart for its engaging storytelling and its inspiring take on the ancient fairy tale Cinderella. I was always fascinated by the story of Cinderella, as it was about a young woman who was mistreated by her stepfamily after her father died. However, things do get better for her when her fairy godmother came and granted Cinderella's wish to go to the ball and dance with the prince. But unfortunately, Cinderella had to leave the ball by midnight due to the magic wearing off by that time, and once Cinderella made her getaway, she leaves behind her glass slipper on the palace steps. The prince finds the glass slipper and then declares that whoever fits the glass slipper shall become his wife. So they tried the glass slipper on all the maidens of the land until they came to Cinderella's household, and when they tried the glass slipper on Cinderella, it fit, and she and the prince were married and lived happily ever after. The end. So now that you know the whole story of Cinderella, I would like to talk about how much the original fairy tale inspired this movie. The movie has a lot of similarities to the original Cinderella fairy tale, although that's obvious since this is, after all, a Cinderella story. The main protagonist is being mistreated by her stepfamily, she loses a slipper when she runs away from the ball, and she falls in love with the prince. But the movie manages to put a more realistic and modern day spin on the story, modern day as in the setting is in Renaissance era France. There is no magic used in this film, and the movie approaches much heavier themes than the original fairy tale, such as exploring the concept of true love and the divides in social classes. So since each character experiences these different themes at some point in the film, it would probably be best if I talk about each character in this film. Probably my most favorite character in the film is none other than Danielle herself, I love the fact that we have a strong female protagonist in this version of the Cinderella story, as Danielle is shown as being bold and also being able to defend herself very easily against anyone who wants to harm her. I also love the fact that Danielle is mostly friendly towards other people and has a strong passion for life, as it makes her a very likable character. But probably the main aspect of Danielle's personality that I like the best, besides her independent nature, is her love for books. I didn't notice this aspect of Danielle's character when I first watched this film, but when I watched this movie again after all of these years, I realized that Danielle loves to read, and she has such a wonderful passion for books. This actually reminded me of Belle from Disney's Beauty and the Beast, as both characters are independent and they both love to read books. I also love the subtle character development that Danielle goes through in this film. She starts off the movie being a bit meek and never really talked back to her stepmother and her stepsisters. The reason why Danielle did everything that her stepmother asked of her was because she wanted some kind of affection for Ramilla. Danielle had lost her real mother when she was very young, and she barely knew anything about her. So she considered Ramilla to be the closest thing to a mother figure that she ever had. But once Danielle falls in love with Prince Henry and started receiving the love that she never got from her stepmother, she started to realize that Ramilla would never love her, and she stopped trying to earn Ramilla's affection and started paving her own road to happiness. I also love the fact that Danielle started to become more outspoken as the film progresses, as it shows that she wasn't afraid of the people above her station. She had no problem speaking her mind to Prince Henry about how he treated the servants, and she encourages him to treat the servants more respectfully. And when she started to realize that Ramilla and her daughters would never love her, she started to speak out against them, although Ramilla's daughter Jacqueline would soon start to become nicer towards Danielle. Drew Barrymore did such a fantastic job at playing Danielle that I think that this is her best role yet. I love the way that Drew Barrymore is able to convey so many emotions with Danielle's character. Like whenever Danielle is feeling sad or has her heart broken, Drew Barrymore is able to become very emotional during these scenes that I just felt so bad for Danielle at times. This was best conveyed during the scene where Danielle gets rejected by Prince Henry at the ball, and I nearly cried during that scene due to Drew Barrymore's heartbreaking performance. Another character that I was very interested in was Prince Henry himself. Prince Henry is another character who went through some character development as the film progresses. Prince Henry started off the film as being a bit spoiled and not caring about how his actions would affect other people. Also, like Danielle, he craved for true love as he was being forced to marry the Princess of Spain, despite the fact that he doesn't even love her or know her. But when Prince Henry started to spend more time with Danielle, he starts becoming a better person as the film progresses. Even though Danielle was disguised as a courtier during her time with Henry, she starts becoming a positive influence with Henry, as she showed him that he shouldn't treat servants so cruelly and that he should treat them with respect. She also shows Henry that he could do a lot better for the kingdom if he took his position as the Prince of France much more seriously. Henry started off the movie not taking his princely duties seriously, and he even at one point was willing to give up the crown if he wasn't allowed to do what he wanted. Both he and Danielle wanted freedom. Henry wanted to escape from the burden of being a prince, while Danielle wanted to escape from a wicked stepmother. But as the characters develop more in the film, both Danielle and Henry realize that they can't just run away from their problems. They had to face their problems head on in order to get the happy ending that they wanted. Danielle learns that she can't keep letting Ramilla abuse her anymore, while Henry learns that he must take his responsibilities of being the Prince of France much more seriously. I really loved the relationship between Henry and Danielle, as it felt natural and well developed. I like the fact that their relationship with each other had improved their personalities, such as Danielle becoming much more independent and outspoken as the film progresses, and Henry becoming much more caring of his subjects due to Danielle's influence. The fact that both Danielle and Henry were looking for true love and they found it with each other was truly inspiring, and it really sent the message about what true love is all about and how it could have a positive influence on that person. Now let's talk about the main antagonist of the film, Ramilla herself. Ramilla is Danielle's evil stepmother, and she was the cause of all the misery that Danielle went through throughout her life. Now, I had mentioned in my original review of this movie that Ramilla was the purgatory for Danielle. Let me go into more depth with that statement. First off, both Danielle and Ramilla are aware of the social classes that take place during that time. The servants are usually treated rather cruelly by the upper classes, and both Danielle and Ramilla have different reactions to that situation. Ramilla treated all of her servants like dirt and never hesitated in selling any of them off to other countries in order to settle her debts. Danielle, meanwhile, cares for the servants, she was one of them, and would do anything to help them out, whether it be pretending to be a courtier to prevent a servant from being sold, or to make a plea to the prince about how servants should be treated with more respect. Another thing that Danielle and Ramilla have in common is that they both use deception to get what they wanted. Ramilla is willing to lie to the Queen of France about her daughter Marguerite's heroic deeds, despite the fact that Marguerite never performed such deeds, just so Marguerite can marry Prince Henry. Danielle, meanwhile, had deceived Henry at first because she was trying to save a servant from being sold and had actually made several attempts to tell Henry the truth about herself. However, once Ramilla's lies are exposed to the king and queen, she is thoroughly punished for her deception. Danielle, meanwhile, does briefly go through a tragic humiliation in front of Henry when her lies are exposed, but she is able to make up for her lies and win Henry's heart at the end of the movie. I did often wonder why Ramilla became so cruel towards Danielle over the years. It could be chalked up to the moment when Danielle's father had died at the beginning of the movie, and on his dying breath he told Danielle that he loved her and didn't say anything to Ramilla. Well, to be fair, he had just met Ramilla and probably didn't have enough time to fully develop his feelings for her. Danielle, on the other hand, is his daughter, so of course he cares about his own daughter. Heck, even Ramilla brought this point up in the film when she stated to Danielle that she barely knew Danielle's father. I'm assuming that Ramilla was jealous of the love that Danielle received from her father, and she wanted to make Danielle's life as miserable as possible as a result. I was also curious about whether or not Ramilla was even capable of loving Danielle back at any point of her life. When Danielle asked Ramilla if she ever loved her, Ramilla coldly answers, "How could anyone love a pebble in their shoe?" This pretty much stated that Ramilla never had feelings for Danielle and just considered Danielle to be a nuisance rather than one of her daughters, which I found to be very tragic. And this was after Danielle was rejected by Henry at the ball. Poor girl. Which is why during the scene with Danielle's crown princess, as she punishes Ramilla and Marguerite by making them into her servants, is so satisfying to me. Anjelica Huston did a fantastic job at playing Ramilla, as she made Ramilla into a truly vile and cruel character. There were many scenes where Anjelica Huston really sold me on Ramilla's cruel nature, like the scene where she told Danielle that she never loved her. That scene made me really hate Ramilla even more because Danielle spent most of her life trying to please her stepmother, and it was clear that at that point, Danielle was never going to get her stepmother's love. There's not much to say about Marguerite and Jacqueline, Ramilla's two daughters. Marguerite is pretty much as vicious and cruel as her mother, and is the one that Ramilla is trying to get Prince Henry to marry. The scene where Marguerite throws Danielle's beloved book into the fire, which was the last gift that Danielle's father gave to her before he died, really cemented how cruel Marguerite is. That scene was especially notable due to taking place after Marguerite cruelly mocks Danielle's dead mother, and this causes Danielle to punch Marguerite in the face and chase her around the house. That was one of my all-time favorite scenes in the movie, by the way. Jacqueline, on the other hand, is the nicer of the stepsisters, as she rarely treated Danielle badly. I actually wish that we had more scenes between her and Danielle, since it would have been interesting to see how Jacqueline would have developed as a character with her interactions through Danielle. Now that I talked about the things that I liked about this movie, I would like to talk about some of the issues that I have with this film. First of all, I wanted to talk about the historical inaccuracies that many people had complained about. I had to actually look up on the internet to see if any of the characters featured in this film were based off of real-life historical figures. In a way, yes, some of the characters were based off of historical figures, like King Francis I, the Brothers Grimm, Prince Henry, and of course Leonardo da Vinci. And the film didn't mention the French Revolution. However, because this movie is based off a fairy tale and had put some realistic elements to the story, it did tend to take some liberties with the real-life historical backgrounds of some of the characters. Now, I'm not the biggest history buff, so this doesn't really bother me, but I can understand why some history buffs were upset at how this film treated the real-life historical figures being used in this story. Hollywood tends to take a source material, whether it be based off a book or based off a real-life event, and then they either glamorize the material or change it completely. There are times where I'm okay with Hollywood doing this, mainly if the work is fictional. And there are times where I'm not okay with Hollywood doing this, especially if it comes to the point where they start glorifying a specific real-life event in history, but they gloss over the tragic moments of that event. And this is a small nitpick, but if this film takes place in France, then why do the characters have English accents? I mean, shouldn't the characters have French accents if they are living in France? Now, I don't know if this is how people actually talked during the Renaissance era France, or if the film just wanted to give the characters English accents for some reason, but I always found it a bit odd that the characters have English accents if they are living in France. Another issue that I had with this film was that I felt that some of the characters weren't fleshed out enough. I was a bit curious about Ramilla's life before she met Danielle's father. Who was she married to before she married Danielle's father? And what happened to her last husband? Did he die before the events of the story, or did he leave her? All of this might not seem that important to the main story, but he would have explained a bit more about Ramilla's character, besides the fact that her own mother was hard on her when she was young. Another character that I wish that they fleshed out more was Jacqueline, Ramilla's other daughter. It seemed like Jacqueline was just there because in the original Cinderella story, Cinderella had two stepsisters, and it seemed like the movie needed to have two stepsisters in the story to match the original fairy tale. Even though Jacqueline is shown as being the nicer of the stepsisters and had even sympathized with Danielle's plight throughout the movie, there weren't that many moments between Jacqueline and Danielle for her to make a huge difference in Danielle's character arc and her own. The last major issue that I had with this film was the third act. I have complained before in my original review of this movie that I felt that they resolved the problems between Danielle and Henry in the third act a bit too quickly. Sure, I love the fact that Henry apologized for his cruel treatment of Danielle during the ball after Ramilla ruthlessly exposed Danielle as a servant, but it felt a bit odd for Danielle to not go into detail about how Henry's words had hurt her. It would have felt more natural if Danielle was still feeling hurt even after Henry had apologized to her, and I would have loved to see Henry talk more about how his royal upbringing made him a bit too haughty and how Danielle's love for him had made him into a better person. I think that this all chalks up to the third act being much weaker than the first two acts. It seems like they were thinking to themselves, oh wait a minute, we got to end this movie at some point, so let's just rush through the rest of the movie as fast as we can. Never mind that we're rushing through the plot in the process. Ever After was originally rated PG, but it is now rated PG-13 for momentary strong language. The so-called momentary strong language came at the moment when Leonardo da Vinci, yes, that Leonardo da Vinci, dropped the S-bomb towards Henry after Henry cruelly dismisses Danielle from the ball when he finds out that Danielle was really a servant. I don't know how many times a film has to drop the F or S-bombs to get a PG-13 rating, but this was the only instance where the S-word was used since the rest of the film didn't have that much strong language. This is actually one of the few instances where it felt odd for a movie to just suddenly use strong language when they didn't have to. Overall, I give Ever After a score of a 9 out of 10. Sure, there were some characters that weren't well developed, and the third act felt a bit too rushed, but this was one of those rare fairy tale films that had a strong female protagonist who was not only strong and independent, but cares about the people around her. Danielle was a truly remarkable character in this film, and I really felt her determination trying to get her happy ending, despite the social class system of the society that she lives in being against her. This was probably one of the best retellings of the Cinderella story that I have ever seen on the big screen. This was a film that I have watched since childhood, and it continues to stay with me to this very day. Hope you enjoy my review of Ever After.
Psst. Hey you. Have you been enjoying the Reviews 2.0 videos? Want to get an added bonus for viewing these videos? Like getting early access to these videos before they are released on YouTube? Or being able to request what movies and TV shows I should review next? Then please feel free to support these videos through my Patreon account. Check out all of the tier titles on my account and choose which tier title you want to be known as. You could become a new member on the block, an early bird, be a part of the future Bunch team, a backstage passenger, an animation superstar, and last but not least, the honorary supreme. So show off your tier title name to the world once you support the Reviews 2.0 videos through Patreon.